of really sort of getting started with LabKey Sample Manager. Again, if you're just signing on, please feel free to sort of ask questions during this presentation in the Q&A as well. So our sample-centric system has 4 main components. We have sample tracking, workflow management, freezer management, and assay data capture. And for sample tracking, at this point, whatever, 30 minutes in, it's kind of old hat, right? We're capturing the full chain of custody and a detailed history of each sample. And that detailed history is actually something I'm really excited about. And we'll take a look at that timeline as I'm doing the demo. You can use customizable metadata to define sample types and sources. So we have created Sample Manager to be sample and science agnostic. So it's really up to you on the types of information that you want to capture on the samples that you have. And then making it really easy to navigate the lineage of the samples and manage the inventory of the samples that you have. For workflow management, you can create custom workflows to match your lab processes and use templates to help standardize those. And so, we see people using this as a way to get out of email a little bit and sort of just track work within the lab, or even going as far as like, this is our templates are representing our SOPs in the lab, and we want to track this work here as well. So there's really a large spectrum of what you could use workflow management for. You can collaborate by assigning and commenting and uploading files to tasks. And so really giving your team members and people that are helping you out on a piece of work sort of insight into what's going on. And you can manage the workloads of your team members by also sort of viewing this lab-wide view of ongoing work and saying, okay, well, Steve's got way too much on his plate, and maybe Hannah has a little bit lighter of a load. How can we sort of level load this and make this work for the group? Of course, freezer management. So you have the ability to match the freezers and storage options used in the lab. You can also track the storage of and movement of the samples in and out of the freezer, and then really just tracking the volume and the freeze thaw history of those samples as well. And finally, we also have sort of our assay data capture. And so this allows users to aggregate all of their experimental data related to these samples in one system. You can import any type of sample-related data collected in your lab as long as it's in a tabular format. And you can track the status and progress of ongoing experiments. And so you'll kind of see this later as well, is that workflow and assay can be very tightly intertwined in terms of performing the work in the lab. So I'm actually going to jump over to our one of our instances of Sample Manager here. And kind of orient you if you haven't seen Sample Manager before I go into the rest of the presentation. So this is the main dashboard where we can see the different types of samples that we've configured in the lab. We also have the ability to sort of change this charting and say, well, what's really happened in the last month? And you can see we've slowed down our work here at LabKey on samples, but somebody created a blood sample and really sort of toggle through all of these things. We also have the ability to create samples right here from the dashboard and trying to give users an easier way to get their work started. We have the list of work that I'm meant to be doing. So all of these things here have been assigned to me. I'm fairly delinquent on a couple of them, and luckily some of them don't have any due dates. But it gives me a sense of the priority. And you can imagine if I was in a real lab, I've probably got way more than 5 workflows on my plate. And so I'd be able to look at these based on priority level and say, oh, really somebody's given me a high priority item to work with. And so I'm going to start there for the day. I also have some insight into all the active work that my team is doing. And so if I was a manager or if I had some extra capacity, I would be able to take a look at this and see, what I might be able to help with or how we can level load some work on folks. We also give you some insight on the assay data or experimental data that's been recently uploaded, where I can toggle through and look specifically at maybe the CBC data and when it was last generated, and even, again, import that data directly from here as well. In the menu bar, you can kind of get a sense of all of the different capabilities that Sample Manager has, where we're tracking the source types, and these are the origins, sources, things that might describe your sample a little bit better, are sources. And then the different sample types that we have, as well as the assays. And then, of course, our storage capability with all of the different freezers, and our workflow. And so those are kind of the main pieces of Sample Manager. Since we've talked a little bit about these first three, I'm just going to jump into storage. And we have a similar overview here where we can take a look at the different freezers that we have in this lab, and even what the makeup of the freezers are. And so we can see that my -4 is kind of this mixture of different samples, where really my LN2 only has serum samples, which seems a bit odd, but it's totally possible, right? And each of these freezers can actually have its own hierarchy. So if we take a look at, my -4, we can see we've got 3 shelves, and we've got some number of boxes underneath it. We also, at sort of every place, we're also given what capacity these freezers have as well. And so based on the configuration that we have set up and customized, we have the space available. And what types of samples are in this shelf in particular, and if there are any samples checked out. And then I'm also able to look at the sample activity. And so what are the most recent things that I've done to samples in the freezer, and maybe help me get to the freezer that I need to get to a little bit more quickly. So if I go back to sort of maybe the blood sample type, and take a look at one of these blood samples, this is really giving me, the information that I need. We've got 501 blood samples in this system with the customized metadata that sort of we created at LabKey are all here. I have the ability to drill into a sample individually and sort of see that metadata again. I can make a single edit here. I can also see where it is in the freezer, and see if it's checked in or checked out. And right now it's sort of in storage. And the amount that this sample has. I can also get information about the lineage of the sample and where it might have come from. And so in this case, we've got 3 different sources that have been associated with this sample. So by looking at this, I can say this blood sample came from Lab 9, and is part of study 32, and was initially taken from subject 73. And this is helpful when you want to take a look at sort of the deep dive into the metadata, but we actually provide a much better view of this lineage with our lineage graph tool, where you can see, again, sort of the sources of that sample, but then also any of the children that have been generated from this sample. And so this lab is receiving blood samples and processing PBMCs, and then purifying DNA from those cells as well. So it's pretty easy now to get a view of what's been generated from the sample. And I can navigate through this. This is an interactive graph where I can change my sort of point of view in the graph as well. I can also see any of the assays that are associated with this sample in particular. And so we can see that we've run CBC 3 times. Maybe there was like a failure in some other runs that required us to run this more than once. We've got some chemistry data and nutrients data. And I can export this and analyze this. I can add more data if I wanted to as well. We're also able to see what jobs this sample is part of. And so there are, or have been part of. So there are 3 jobs that have been completed. And so the blood analysis suite was done, and then blood analysis was done again. And then we isolated plasma, and then this job sort of was auto created. So we don't know based on the name what happened here, but we can always drill into this job as well and take a look at that. And then lastly, I think we talked about this a little bit, is getting a view of this sample's full audit history and or full chain of custody, really, of what has happened to the sample within the system. And you can see for this blood sample, we've got the registration, we have all of the different assay data that has been uploaded, when samples were added to a job, when they were completed, or when the sample was updated. And if I select any of these, we get even more details on what happened to the sample. And so in this case, we can see, oh, Molly changed that description, which was really helpful for us to sort of understand. We also get a sense of when it was added to storage, and where it is currently sort of in that storage space is above as well. And then, you can see after a while, this sample timeline can get very long. And so you can actually filter. It's not changing the timeline, it's just changing your view of this timeline to where, really I only care about the assay events here. And so let's take a look at those. And that will really drastically reduce the amount of information that I see in the timeline. And so I think, that probably orients folks enough for me to go on. We're going to go back and forth between the presentation and the demo for now, but I will sort of pop back into the slides here. And if you're interested in sort of testing this out yourself, please request a demo or trial using this Zoom link in the chat. See if you're able to add that, or will, that would be great. I'm always happy to talk to new people. I know Steve and Jason are as well. And so we'd love to have you take a look and ask us questions. So let's say you're at the point of sort of looking at Sample Manager. This feels like the right tool for you. How do you get started? And so I think the biggest thing to start with are, what are the pieces of information that your lab is interested in storing in Sample Manager, and really capturing all of those, and then starting to sort of go through all of these different components of Sample Manager that we've talked about. And the first thing that I would recommend, of course, these are all guidelines and recommendations, but really the first thing that I would recommend is to start by identifying what are your sources and what are your samples. And in general, what we've considered sources are sort of, mice, humans, other animals from which samples have been taken, or lab studies, projects, or other sort of non-physical things, mountains, forests, places, locations, that type of thing. Those can all be tracked as sources. And really, samples, seems very silly to define this, but I think it's important, is that these are sort of the physical things in your lab, blood, tissues, dirt, cell culture, other things that are taken from those sources that you've defined. And the main thing to consider here is that samples can be added to storage, they can be assigned to workflows associated with assay data, and have that full sample timeline. So if you're debating back and forth, is this a source or is this a sample? Maybe take a look at those requirements and say, do we need to add it to storage? Then yes, it should be a sample. Or is this something that we really care about having that full sample timeline on? In that case, definitely make it a sample. And how might you get sources and samples in? Well, through the UI, and I'll show that to you in a minute. You can create these manually. You can have a file, an Excel file or a tabular file set up and sort of do a big import as well. And then with some versions of Sample Manager, you could also do this through the API if you're sort of more technically inclined. So I'm going to actually show you how to walk through this for our instance. And my Zoom screen is right in my way here. So I'm going to move this over. So if you were to request a trial from us, this is what you would get. We have actually pre-populated some of the data here for you. So you can see that we've got some DNA samples, we have some assay data, there's no real jobs here. But if I open this up, I can also see, we've got some mice sources and one of our freezers set up. But let's say, you take a look at this and it's like, Hannah, I don't do DNA. Like, I don't know. None of this is really sort of applicable to me in my lab, right? I have an example that's could be useful here, where I've got subjects that have had some finger sticks, and we are collecting those finger stick samples and running a COVID-19 antibody test on them. And so I've got the data sort of here locally set up, and I just want to show you how easy it is to set this up. And so the first thing I'm going to do, back to my slides, is I want to consider what my sources are and what my samples are. And in this case, my source is fairly easy to identify. It is the subject. And so I'm going to create that subject source. I'm going to leave sort of the naming pattern as it is. So one of the advantages of Sample Manager is that you can have Sample Manager define your IDs, or you can define them manually. It's really up to you. You can also change this, but essentially what this naming pattern tells us is name all of my subjects source with sort of an incrementing value after it. I also have the opportunity to manually define fields, but that's going to get boring really fast for you guys to watch me do. And so I actually have a file here that I'm going to drag and drop. And LabKey is going to infer, Sample Manager is going to infer the file values for me. And so I'm just going to finish creating the source type. And now I want to get this data in. And so I'm going to just import these sources. I'm going to go quickly here. This isn't meant to be sort of a detailed training, but more of a guide on how you can do these things. So once I've dropped my subjects file in, you can see we get a nice little preview of the data I'm about to import. I'm going to import it. And now we've got the 100 subjects that I wanted to register here are attached. The next thing I want to do is also create now my finger sticks. And question is, are finger sticks a sample or a source? And I think it should be pretty clear by now that these are really samples. We want to track assay data about them. We want to put them in the freezer. We want to do, all the sample related things that we'd want to be able to do here. So I'm going to just add my sample name. I could call this sort of blood. I could do anything here. I'm also going to add a source alias. So this really tells the system what column in my Excel file is related to my subjects, and it helps me provide that lineage to my samples very easily. I could choose to change the color, and then I also need to say, what is going to be my standard sort of stored amount of this sample in the system. Again, I have the ability to manually define these fields, but I'm not going to do that. Instead, I'm going to drag and drop a file here again. We're going to infer some of that information. I also get prompted with this question of, do I want to create barcodes for these samples? And it's like, yeah, actually, that I think would be extremely useful. So I'm going to add that, and we have a barcode field that I don't have in my Excel file. And I'll finish creating this sample. I want to now get the samples that I have into the system. And so I'm going to bring those in here. You can see I get another sort of view of what my data looks like. I'm capturing the date that the sample was collected, from which hand we did the finger prick, and then sort of that source ID again. So this is going to attach that lineage for me. And so when we do that, we can see that I now have my 200 samples. In addition to that, Sample Manager has generated a unique barcode for me. We don't encode these as a barcode, but if I wanted to print a label off, our integration with Bartender would allow me to encode this barcode onto my sample label. And so really it's, as quick as that. I've got sources in, I've got samples in. I probably have a lot of other things to do. So let's take a look back at my presentation. And really the next thing to do is to capture my freezer and other cold storage hierarchies. And so when you're doing this, it's good to sort of know, what is your freezer information? Do you have names for your freezers? And sort of writing those things down, and the types of things you may want to capture around your freezer in general. And then really understanding the storage hierarchy. So, a -80 is going to be different from a sort of fridge freezer combo, which is also going to be different from an LN2. And so understanding what that storage hierarchy is before you start creating in the system is very helpful. And then also capturing sort of the needed terminal storage locations. So these can be boxes, bags, plate. LabKey will actually provide you with a lot of these, but you can also decide if you want to customize your own. We can take a look at that as well. And then sort of the last thing to do is create it in Sample Manager. And it probably took me as long to explain this as it is going to be to create this system. So we'll pop back in over here, and we can see that I've already got a -80 freezer set up. Now, that's not really what I wanted to do, right? I want to create maybe a new freezer that's going to be tracking these finger prick samples. And so instead, I'll go back to my freezer overview. I'm going to maybe first take a look at my storage units and say, does LabKey have all of the things that I want to do in my freezer system? And in this case, we've got different bags and boxes. We could create our own. Maybe instead of these boxes, I'm also capturing like a 4x4 box. I can then set my columns and rows, and really expand this and also define, do I want those, do I want it to be row, column, and how I want it to be called, right? Each lab and even within the lab, this naming can be different. And so it's really helpful to be able to customize this and generalize this for your purposes. So now that I'm done with that, I actually want to go back and create a new freezer. And in this case, we're just going to call it a demo freezer. We'll say this is for the spring meeting. I can enter the manufacturer here and a freezer model and the temperature. We're just going to create another -80. And then I can define my freezer hierarchy. So I can pull in my shelf information. And let's say for each of these, we've got a shelf, and then there's a rack within it, and maybe there is a 10 by 10 box. And so now you can see my drop down includes my newly customized box as well. I can easily sort of copy this next box. And then I can also really easily say, okay, this looks good. Maybe for each shelf, I have 2 different racks. And then for this freezer, maybe I also have 3 different shelves, right? And so this allows me to sort of very quickly create a freezer hierarchy. And so I could have done this at the beginning as well. And at this point, I know that I want my samples in the freezer. So how do I do that? How do I get these in? Well, there's a variety of ways, right? I can go into this hierarchy system and select a box and choose to add samples from here. But I actually also have this in my file, and this is a really good way if I'm maybe migrating from another freezer management system. I don't want to go through this manually. I especially don't want to go through this manually if I've got probably more than a box worth of samples. So instead of doing it sort of through the UI like this, I want to just import this file. I'm going to go back to my finger sticks. I'm going to import again. And I'm going to drop in a file that has my sample IDs and my storage location, as well as where it is in the box, and then any sort of other information I want to track, like the freeze thaw count or the stored amount. I'm going to update this data. And I think my internet is unusually slow this morning. But now we can see that these samples are in storage, where they are in storage, and I can even sort of drill in exactly to where that sample is. And we can see that here it is in rack 1, box 2, at sort of this J10 location, right? From here, if I wanted to sort of do my manual work and check samples in and out, I would be able to do that. I can check it out. I didn't add a comment here. I can also check it back in. Maybe this time I say it's for the demo. I can say how much I used, right? This was just for the demo, so I didn't actually use any volume. I also can choose if I want to increment the freeze thaw count. Because I was just doing this as an example, maybe I didn't actually move, take this in and out of the freezer. And so I have the ability to not increment that, although that's the default action. I also have the ability now to move these samples or discard them. And so what I really want to do is sort of take this whole row of samples, and I want to discard them from the freezer. And then I want to show you what happens after that. So if I'm discarding, we are now able to see they're not part of the freezer. One of the other cool things that we've implemented in our freezer management system is location history. So this is very helpful in troubleshooting if you expect a sample to be there and it's not, or there's a sample that is not sort of in the right place. You can examine the location history and be able to help troubleshoot what happened. So in this case, I can say, oh yeah, I discarded this sample 191. I can go to that sample. I'm not in some audit log, right? We're just showing sort of that regular sample overview with just the fact that it's been discarded. If I go back to my finger sticks, I can also search for samples that are not in the freezer. So in this case, we have samples that are not in storage, and these are the 10 that I just discarded. So again, those records are being maintained and they're kept around even after they've been removed from the freezer. So with that, we'll pop back into the presentation, and we were able to sort of capture that hierarchy and the storage that we had for this demo. And now we really want to look at the assay data, and this is where I think that there's a lot of sort of personal discretion that comes when you're defining what might be assay data versus just what's data you want to add to your sample metadata. And so really, if we sort of go back to the very, very, very basics that you probably learned many, many years ago, or at least in my case, assay data is really a measurement taken on a sample. So oftentimes when we think about assay data in Sample Manager, it's assay data that can be captured maybe multiple times on a single sample. So if we're running an assay and the QC fails, we might need to rerun that. And we want to capture the fact that we ran it once and it failed, and then we ran it again and hopefully it passed. And so that would be a way to do that. Or if you're taking longitudinal measurements on a given sample, that would be another way. It's also useful when you want flexibility in measurements taken on a given sample. So if you add something like purity to a sample type, that's something that we would maybe expect to see on all of your samples that you have of that type. But maybe purity is only taken in some cases, and in another case, you're doing something else with those samples. So allowing assay data to be associated with these samples sort of gives you the flexibility in what you want to capture around these samples overall in the lab. And then sometimes it really does make more sense to add it as a column in a sample type. And that's when it is a consistent value across all of the samples that you only plan to capture once. And that might be something like if your sample is a piece of a tree, it might be sort of the measurement at collection, right? That might be 3 inches or 5 inches or something. And that's not going to change over time. And you're not going to recapture that measurement, maybe that height at collection, we would call it. And then when it's integral in defining a sample, so if it's really important to make sure that it's not getting lost in the shuffle in the lab, having it in a sample type column, it can be helpful as well. So again, how do you get experimental data in? Well, you can do it in a lot of different places in the application, within a samples grid. You can go directly to that assay and upload samples. You can upload assay data through a workflow, and all of these options support sort of manually entering the data. And so this would be me typing it out, copying and pasting from a file, or even uploading a file. And I'll show you some examples of this today as well. Or, through the API for those of you that are technically inclined. So we'll go back here to my finger stick example. And in this case, we have qPCR data, and that's not really what we want to do here. We want to attach COVID-19 antibody results to our finger stick. So instead, I'm going to go to assays. I'm going to create a new assay design. Describe it here. It's just going to be my COVID-19 antibody test. Maybe we'll say again, this is for the spring meeting demo. And I have the option here to define run fields and different results fields, but in this case, we're going to make it a fairly simple example. Again, can manually define these fields, or I can use the file that I've already created to sort of infer the fields that I need. And so in this case, I'm going to capture the sample ID, of course. The antibodies, if the antibody was detected, and the test date, and then sort of the QC status. And so this assay is sort of getting imported post QC of the work. So I can import data here. I can also import data on through a sample or through a workflow, but we're just going to do it directly from this UI. I can set my assay ID here. And as I mentioned, we can upload a file, we can enter data directly into a grid or sort of copy and paste it. In this case, I've got a file sort of nicely lined up. So I'm just going to drag and drop that same file. Again, we get a preview to make sure that I know that I'm doing the right thing, and it looks like it is. And so now I'm going to import this data. I can use this grid as I want. I can start searching for things that the QC status is failed on and sort of interrogate those further, see what might have happened there. But now that this assay data is associated in the system, I can start taking a look at this in relationship to my samples and to even my sources. And so if I go into some finger sticks again and look at my S200 sample, we now have assay data associated with it. And you see for this one sample, we actually have two different results. And you can see that the one ran on January 31st, the QC actually failed. And so we needed to rerun it the next day, and the QC passed. And so this is really sort of the final result here. But it's giving me that full history of what's happened to the sample. I can also see this in context. So for this example, I might be interested in the subject as a whole, right? And how has the testing gone on them throughout time for their COVID antibodies. And so from this subject, I can see sort of the metadata that we've defined on it, as well as the lineage. We can see that this person has actually gotten 3 different finger sticks. And I can get even some more information about that, as like when they've been collected and where those samples are in the freezer, as well as my assay results. So if we take a look at this again, we can see that, the first 2 sort of past QC tests were this person did not have COVID-19 antibodies, but then this last sample 174, we had a failed QC, and then sort of that past run that tells us that, yeah, now they have COVID-19 antibodies. So, sometime between June and December, they got the virus or the vaccine, maybe not the vaccine in that time frame, but something like that, where those antibodies now are detected. So hopping back into my presentation, we sort of considered that assay data and structure and got that in the system. The last thing to consider is sort of, what are the standard workflows in the lab? And so you can see we've done all of this without tracking our work, which may be okay, but maybe I really want to see, like, well, who is running those tests and who's running the assays that failed, and how can I track that within the lab? So workflows would be a way to do that. When you start to consider workflows, it's really important to think about, what regular work might you be able to create templates in our workflows for really standardizing the work. We allow for both templated jobs as well as non-templated jobs. So that might be something like, oh, I'm doing a demo and here are the quick things that I'm setting up, versus this is a sample receipt that we're doing day in and day out, and we want to track that pretty exactly. You can also add experimental data if it is getting generated as part of your work, and I'll kind of show you how that occurs as well. And then using assignment and notification for that better collaboration. You can schedule the work with due dates and priority setting, adding comments, uploading files, things like that. So if I go back into the demo, we did things a little bit backwards. We added all of our assay data before we had a workflow. And so this might be something that we we adjust later as part of our work. But I can get to workflow from here. We can see that that Sample Manager is already providing me with some templates sort of in relationship to the mouse DNA example that they have, but we're not running qPCR here. And so instead, I really want to create a workflow template. And in this case, we're going to call it my finger stick sample receipt. I can define these specific job tasks that are related to this process of receiving the samples. So maybe the first thing is I want to register the samples. I want to receive them into the lab. I want to add them to storage. And then even maybe before that, maybe I want to QC my samples and make sure that they look good before I do that. And so at each of my task levels, I can also assign assays related to them. In this case, we don't have any assay data needed, but if we were creating a template for our COVID-19 testing, for example, we would be able to add that and that would show up in our workflow as well. I can attach files. So if we needed to have sort of a standardized SOP or some sort of templates here, we would be able to do that to give users some more insight. So in this case, we now have our sample receipt template overview. I can go into my fingerstick examples. You know, we've already sort of received these samples, but maybe I want to sort of backfill some of this work that we did. And so I'll just select these first 20 and I'm going to start a new job with those selected samples. And this is our ad hoc tool where sort of I would do the same thing. I can define all my job tasks, but since I went through the work of creating a template, I really want to use that template. And so in this case, it's right here under my sample receipt. I can choose the template. I still get to define the name. And so, you know, in this case, I'm just going to call it my spring meeting demo job. I can also assign the owner and notify additional users as well. Since this is sort of a brand new instance, I haven't added anybody new, but that would be possible. And I can also set job start and due dates. And so this sort of gives me a sense of like, yeah, I want this to happen in a certain time frame. And given this is the demo, you know, we want to do it urgently as well. We can see that the tasks defined from my template are showing up here. I can now assign those to people. In this case, because I'm the only one, you know, that it's all going to be me. You don't have to assign them to people. You know, as the job owner, I would get notified of all of these things as well. And we can double check the samples that I added and say, oh yeah, there are samples that these are the samples that I want associated with this demo job. Again, I can add files if I've got some pictures maybe of samples that were received that weren't properly shipped or stored or something like that. I would be able to track that here as well. Once I finish creating this job, we can see sort of all that metadata I associated with it in terms of the status of the progress of the job, as well as looking at the different tasks. So this is kind of our task overview. I can dive into certain tasks and leave a comment, you know, receive these this morning, something like that, where it's sort of like, I'm only getting to this now. I could reassign work here if I wanted to as well, but really sort of just going through and completing this task. I also have the option to look at my samples that are associated with this job here and do things with it. So, you know, remember we deleted some of these samples, we discarded them from storage, and maybe I want to add them back. At this point, I don't even have to bother filtering. LabKey is going to know that I already have some of these samples to storage. So I'm going to just select my samples and say, add them to storage. And now we're presented both with the fact that, only 10 of the 20 samples I selected are going to be added, but I also get to choose where it goes and say, okay, well, I'm going to go back into my demo freezer, back into shelf 1, rack 1. You can see for box 1 that Sample Manager is letting me know you don't have enough room for those 10 samples in this box. And so I know to check a different box. And so maybe in this case, I actually even want to go into rack 2 and put it there. I would be able to select those. I'm presented with this option of moving them around, but really LabKey is just giving you sort of the next available positions. And I can also add the amounts here. The units are by default in microliters. So if I had something different, I would be able to set that here. Or I could also reset some of the freeze thaw accounts as well. So I can now add these to the box and you can see, there they are. And that was fairly simple. I'm going to go back to my workflow queue and see that I've still got this spring meeting work I need to do. And so in this case, I had QC'd them and I've also added them to storage. And so really now this job is done. And I've kind of gone through the parts of the demo that I wanted to go through. So I'll hop back over here and I think now this kind of gives you a good sense of how to get started, right? We did this in, I think, less than an hour. So it really is that easy to get started with Sample Manager and to start using the system for your lab. So at this point, Steve, I'll take any questions.
Great. We've got a lot of great questions here. One question here. Is it possible to allow all the users to be able to update a storage unit name, but disallow some users from deleting a storage unit? I'm not, do you get that?
Yeah. So we don't have that capability right now. Mostly the roles that we have for users in Sample Manager are administrator, editor, or reader. And administrator really are sort of the site demigods, as you will. They can set up the structures of sources and samples and freezers and be able to change those names. I would love to talk to that user more to see about what their use case is. So in that case, the admin would be able to do those things. But we're not disallowing delete from those admins, right? So I think we would want to sort of talk about what the needs, for that are, because it's a very interesting use case. And maybe later than this year on my roadmap is to sort of determine how we might have a more advanced permissioning model as well.
Great. Another question, this is about the freezer hierarchy. Are you going to add buildings and room type storage units?
Yeah, so we've definitely heard that question a lot, and it's something that we've been thinking about. What I recommend that people do for now, while we don't have that, is define the location in the name of your freezer. So we can actually, we could go into our demo freezer and as an admin, I can do this, right? I could change this and say, oh, this is Seattle LabKey building. We'll call it one of our conference rooms is Griffin. And so that would give us a sense of where this is sitting. But in order to sort of fully lay out that feature, we would want to have a little bit of a redesign on this dashboard. So it's certainly on the roadmap to consider, and feedback we've heard from quite a lot of folks as well.
Great. Another question here. Is it possible or planned to have freezer monitoring systems integrated into Sample Manager? And there's more actually. This would be important for us, for instance, to check not only the freeze thaw count, but also have the temperature curve and any alarms that
Yep.
occur for a particular freezer.
Yeah, it's I would say it's not particularly high on the list for our sample-centric freezer management system. I do think that as we get into more of a LIMS where we're catering to groups where that becomes slightly more important, I'd say it is something that we are considering. We have the option now to have some advanced settings. If you've got a sensor name or an acceptable loss rate or things, you can track that here. It's not necessarily giving you the option of integrating with a freezer monitoring system, but it is something that we have been considering. And if that person is using a freezer monitoring system, we'd love to know which freezer monitoring system, because of course that'll be important in the types of integrations we do.
Great. Another question. Does Sample Manager support chemical plant quality inspection lab testing? We might have hundreds of assays and the menu may not fit them. Something.
Yeah, so not being familiar with those assay types, I would say my general answer of that, we are science agnostic. So if what you saw today in creating your own assays sort of worked for you, I think that's certainly possible. The number of assays are not limited here. So as soon as we get a really, really long list, I'll see, I don't think we've even got one in our demo here, but you can see that it gets longer. But as soon as this list gets longer, we've got a little option here that will show all, 150 assays or something like that, if that's something that your lab has created. But certainly possible to structure and create your assays however it matches, the experiments that you're doing in real life.
Great. Another question. How long has the app been built?
Yeah.
And how many customers are using it?
Yeah, so we had launched Sample Manager last year in January, and then we've launched, and that was a smaller version of this, but really included still sort of samples and assays and workflow tracking. And we heard a lot last year how important freezer management was from prospective clients and from users. And so that was really the next thing for us to build. So we launched the freezer management portion of this in January of this year of 2021. And so far have, I would say, sort of a handful of clients that have been using the application as is, with sort of another handful that are extending it from their LabKey server premium editions as well, which probably don't have time to get into those, but that's certainly another option to use Sample Manager.
Great. Another question. Is it possible to change my mind if I want to set up my sources and samples differently?
Absolutely. So the system is really flexible, and we will, the maybe upside or downside of this is that we're going to audit that mind change. And so if you decide that for some reason, subjects do need to be a sample type, or maybe you want to add or change metadata around that, that's no problem, right? There are mechanisms in LabKey that will allow you to make bulk changes through that file import that we went through. And so if I needed to sort of re-switch all of these 200 samples to point at a different source, maybe it's not subjects or maybe something like that, I would be able to easily do that through that file import wizard with some just sort of easy administration changes. Maybe it's not a source ID from subjects anymore. Maybe I'm adding my sample ID from, excuse me, I pressed the wrong button, a sample ID from my DNA samples. We'll just say that that's scientifically accurate. But certainly you could make those changes as you need to, and it's flexible enough to handle that.
Great. And another question, are there examples of how I should structure my data to get it into Sample Manager?
Yeah, absolutely. So we have a whole docs environment that sort of walks you through getting started in Sample Manager. And so that really allows you to get started and provides you with file examples that you can use. We also provide these examples for you in the app itself. So if I had created these, or maybe let's go to DNA, right? I haven't created these today, but I'm looking to import samples, but it's like, oh, shoot, what are all of the columns that I need? We're providing you with that template that would really sort of tell me what that data structure needs to look like for DNA samples to get in.
Great, thank you. That's all the questions we have right now. If you have some more questions, here's your chance, folks.
Yeah, absolutely. And if you want a demo or if you want to go through this with your data, please reach out to the link I think that had been placed in the chat maybe, and we'll probably be in a further email as well to get a demo set up, and we can really help you with your specific case as well.
Well, great. If there aren't any more questions, although please enter them, it's not over yet. Thanks to everybody, and hopefully we'll see you tomorrow. Bernard Lee and myself are going to be talking about LabKey biologics and collaboration, especially inside of the biopharmaceutical production world. Oh, we have another question. We may store both samples and non-samples, like reagents, for example, in the same freezer. How to store non-sample items?
Yeah, so we don't technically have a solution for inventory yet, although we do have clients that are using this as an inventory management system as well. And really just creating a sample type of your inventory items has worked well for most folks, but do know that this is something that we plan to support more explicitly in the future as well.
And another one. Some freezers only use racks and boxes. Is it possible to remove other built-in storage units that are not used for these freezers, such as bags and canes from the left side of the editing panel? So do you get the question? I think I do.
Yeah. So I think because that storage creation and the hierarchy is created by administrators, our hope is that administrators are knowledgeable enough that they don't need the types of restrictions I think that this person is asking for, given that it should be a fairly small group of people that have those rights. So again, I think probably something more to talk about with this user, but it's from my perspective, I think that seems like a big ask to sort of limit admins on. Like then we just need like multiple levels of administrators, which may be fine and accurate, but I'd like to talk to that user a little bit more on that.
Sure.